In the autumn of 1947, on a wind-scoured patch of land in the Montana high country, Elias Thorne was doing something that made no sense. He was unloading the bones of a dead machine, curved steel ribs, dozens of them, stacked like the vertebrae of some long-extinct beast. They were salvaged from a surplus military auction, the skeleton of a Quonset hut that had likely seen service in a place far warmer than this. His neighbors, men who understood the logic of logs and the honesty of stone, would slow their trucks on the gravel road to watch. They saw a man wrestling with wartime scrap, and they saw a fool. Silas Croft, a man whose hands had raised half the log cabins in the valley, a man whose skill with an axe and an adze was legendary, just shook his head. He watched Thorne haul the cold, unyielding metal into place on a peculiar foundation of concrete and stone. The whispers started at the trading post, then grew louder at the church social. They called it Thorne's Folly. Some, with a darker turn of mind, began calling it the tin coffin. They imagined the winter, the brutal, soul-crushing Montana winter, and what it would do to a family living inside a metal can. They pictured frost an inch thick on the inside of those steel ribs. They pictured a fire burning itself out in a desperate, futile war against the conductive power of metal. Elias Thorne heard the whispers. He saw the looks. But he said little, his face calm and his movements deliberate. He just kept working, his past experience as an Army Corps of Engineers mechanic guiding his hands. What did this quiet wheelwright, this tinkerer of gears and axles, understand about shelter that a generation of master builders had missed? What secret was he bolting together under that vast, unforgiving sky? If you believe in the power of stubborn ingenuity, that quiet confidence that precedes a revolution, then hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us what's the most unconventional home you have ever seen, because you are about to witness how a pile of military junk became the most important structure in the territory. To understand the genius of what Elias Thorne was building, you must first understand the enemy he was fighting. The enemy was not merely the cold, it was a far more subtle and relentless force: thermodynamics. In this part of Montana, winter was not a season, it was a siege. It began in October with a chilling wind that stripped the aspen trees bare, and it did not release its grip until a reluctant April. The cold was a physical presence. It crept through the smallest cracks. It radiated from the earth. It fell from the sky in crystalline flakes that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air. Temperatures of 20 below zero were common. Stretches of 30 below were expected. And once or twice a generation, an Arctic maw would open and breathe upon the land, plunging the mercury to 40, even 50 below zero Fahrenheit. This was a cold that changed the nature of things. It made steel brittle enough to shatter like glass. It froze ink inside its wells and turned a cup of tossed water into a shower of ice before it hit the ground. It was a cold that could kill a man who made a single mistake, who misjudged his firewood, or who failed to patch a chink in his wall. The accepted wisdom, the technology of survival, was the log cabin. These structures were monuments of craft and tradition, built by men like Silas Croft. They were beautiful, solid, and deeply connected to the landscape. They were also fundamentally flawed. The massive logs, felled and shaped by hand, were excellent thermal mass, but they were poor insulators. A 12-inch log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 14. Modern, cheaply built walls have a higher rating. The real weakness was in the connections. Hundreds of feet of chinking, a mixture of mud, moss, and lime, sealed the gaps between the logs. But wood and earth expand and contract at different rates. The house was in constant, subtle motion. As the temperature plunged, the logs would shrink, and microscopic fissures would open in the chinking. The wind, that ever-present Montana wind, would find these cracks. Living in a conventional cabin during a cold snap was an exercise in strategic retreat. Families would abandon the outer rooms, hanging blankets over doorways to consolidate their living space into a single, chilly area around the wood stove. The floors were always cold. The walls leached heat from anyone who leaned against them. A rime of frost would grow on the heads of nails driven into the walls from the outside, tiny conduits of cold that blossomed into frozen flowers indoors. The consumption of fuel was astronomical. A family might burn through a full cord of wood, a tightly stacked pile 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet deep, in less than 2 weeks of severe cold. The work was endless. Felling trees, bucking them into rounds, splitting, stacking. It was a year-round battle to gather enough energy to survive the winter. And even then, comfort was a luxury few could afford. The goal was not to be warm. It was simply to be less cold. Elias Thorne knew this reality. He had spent his first 2 winters in a small, rented cabin, and he had felt the insidious drain of energy. He had felt the drafts on the back of his neck while his face was scorched by the stove. But unlike his neighbors, he did not see the problem through the eyes of a carpenter. He saw it through the eyes of an engineer. During the war, he hadn't been on the front lines. He had been in the Aleutian Islands, a place of screaming winds and damp, penetrating cold. His job was to keep the engines running, the generators, the trucks, the aircraft. He learned about heat exchangers, about intake manifolds, about the critical importance of managing airflow and temperature. He learned how a small adjustment to a carburetor could mean the difference between a running engine and a frozen block of steel. And he had lived and worked in Quonset huts. He saw how the military erected them in days. He also saw their weaknesses. Uninsulated, they were ovens in the brief summer and ice boxes in the winter. But Elias saw the potential in their form. The curved arch was structurally brilliant, shedding snow and resisting wind better than any peaked roof. More importantly, it had no corners. He knew from his work with engines that corners created turbulence and dead spots in airflow. A smooth, curved surface promoted gentle, predictable circulation. He didn't see a pile of scrap metal. He saw a prefabricated, structurally perfect shell. He saw a chassis waiting for an engine. His neighbors saw a man building a house out of the wrong materials. Elias knew the materials were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the system. And the system he was about to build would treat his house not as a fortress against the cold, but as a machine for living in it. The construction of Thorne's Folly began not with walls, but with a hole. Elias dug deeper than any other foundation in the valley, well below the 4-foot frost line. He spent weeks with a horse-drawn scraper and a shovel, creating a shallow, rectangular pit where his home would stand. This alone was a source of curiosity. Most cabins were built on simple stone piers or shallow trench footings. Into this pit, he laid his first secret. He hauled dozens of wagon loads of smooth, rounded stones from the riverbed, filling the excavation to a depth of 3 feet. He packed them tightly, creating a dense, porous mass. Over this, he poured a 6-inch concrete slab reinforced with wire mesh he had salvaged. The community saw a man wasting time and concrete. Elias saw a battery. He was building a massive subterranean heat sink, a thermal flywheel that would store and release energy with incredible slowness and stability. Next came the steel ribs. He and his wife Sarah wrestled them into place, bolting them to the edges of the concrete slab. The iconic arched shape of the Quonset rose against the sky. It was stark and alien amongst the pines and log structures. This was the phase of construction that earned the project its derisive nickname. It looked flimsy, industrial, and temporary. Silas Croft chose this moment to pay a visit. He walked onto the site with the slow, confident gait of a man who knows his craft. He respected Elias as a wheelwright, but this was a different matter entirely. He stood beside the naked steel frame, running a hand over the cold metal. "Elias," he began, his voice devoid of malice, filled with genuine concern. "I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to build fast and cheap. But you can't cheat the winter." Elias stopped his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. He simply nodded for Silas to continue. "That steel," Silas said, tapping a rib with his knuckle. It rang with a dull, chilling tone. "That steel is a death sentence. It has no R value to speak of. It will be 30 below outside, and that metal will be 30 below. Every bit of moisture from your breath, from your cooking pot, from your bodies, will fly to it. You're building an ice cave. That metal will sweat, and that sweat will freeze into a solid sheet of ice on your walls. You're building a tomb for your family." The argument was sound. It was based on every known principle of construction in that climate. Metal conducted cold with ruthless efficiency. Silas was not being cruel. He was stating an obvious and dangerous fact. Elias Thorne looked at the respected builder. He looked at his framework of steel. Then he gave his simple, unadorned reply. "The steel isn't the house, Silas," he said quietly. "It's just the skeleton. The skin is what matters." Silas shook his head and walked away, convinced he had just warned a man who was too stubborn to listen to reason. He had done his duty. What Silas didn't see was the next, most crucial step. Elias attached the corrugated steel sheathing to the outside of the ribs, creating the familiar Quonset shell. It was now a big, hollow drum. Then he began to build another house inside the first one. Using cheap, rough-sawn pine, he built a conventional stud wall that followed the curve of the steel ribs, but was not attached to them. He maintained a meticulous, unbroken 6-inch gap between the inner surface of the steel and the outer surface of his wooden frame. He was creating a cavity, an interstitial space that was the core of his entire design. This air gap was his primary insulation, but he didn't stop there. He filled the wooden stud bays, another 4 inches of space, with anything he could find. He bought surplus wool batting, musty and smelling of lanolin. He got truckloads of sawdust and wood shavings for free from the local sawmill. He packed it all in, creating a thick, insulated blanket between his family and the air gap. The final inner wall was simple tongue-and-groove pine planking. When he was done, an observer standing inside would see a cozy, curved wooden room. They would have no idea that 6 inches beyond that wood was a dead air space, and beyond that, the steel skeleton that everyone believed was the house itself. He had built a thermos. The outer steel shell would get brutally cold, as Silas had predicted. But that cold would have to fight its way across 6 inches of still air, then through 4 inches of dense insulation, before it could even begin to touch the interior living space. The final piece of the system was the engine. In the center of the concrete slab, he had left a square opening. Here he built a platform of brick and mortar. Upon this platform, he placed his cast-iron wood stove. But the stove's air intake did not come from inside the house. A traditional stove would suck in the warm air it had just created and send it up the chimney, creating a negative pressure that pulled cold drafts in from every crack in the house. Elias's stove was different. He ran a 4-inch steel pipe from the stove's air intake down through the brick platform into the river rock foundation. The pipe then turned 90 degrees and ran 20 feet through the heart of that thermal battery before turning up and exiting through the foundation wall to the outside. This was the system's lung. When the stove drew in air for combustion, it was not pulling precious warm air from the living space. It was pulling frigid outside air on a long, slow journey through the rock bed that had been passively warmed by the house above it. The air entering the stove was not negative 30 degrees. It was pre-warmed to 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This made the fire burn hotter, cleaner, and far more efficiently. The house was a complete, integrated machine. The stove's radiant heat warmed the concrete slab and the river rocks below, charging the thermal battery. The charged battery then radiated gentle, even warmth back up through the floor, day and night. The curved ceiling prevented warm air from stagnating at the peak, promoting a constant, gentle convection current that circulated warmth to every part of the home. It was a closed loop, a self-regulating engine designed for maximum efficiency. Elias Thorne was finished just as the first snows began to fall. The winter of 1947 began with a deceptive mildness. The early snows were light, and the temperatures hovered in the teens, cold but manageable. The residents of the valley settled into their familiar winter rhythms. The mockery of Thorne's folly subsided into a kind of watchful waiting. The real test was yet to come. In the second week of December, the radio began to crackle with warnings. A weather phenomenon the old-timers called a Siberian express was pushing down from the Arctic. It was not a storm, but a solid, cohesive mass of unimaginably cold, dense air moving with the slow, inexorable force of a glacier. The first sign was the sky. It turned a strange, pale, crystal-clear blue. There was no wind. The air grew perfectly still, and a profound silence fell over the landscape. The temperature at dawn on Monday was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 5 below zero. By Tuesday morning, it was -20. The wind had arrived, a low, keening moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was not a gusting wind, but a steady, pressing force that drove the cold into every fiber of wood, every pane of glass, every crack in the earth. This was the beginning of the great test. Inside the log cabins of the valley, the battle for survival began. Wood stoves that had been gently warming homes were now roaring, their metal sides glowing a dull cherry red. The heat they produced was intense, but it was a localized, desperate heat. 6 feet from the stove, the air was frigid. The suffering was acute and specific. Silas Croft, in his own masterfully built home, watched the chinking between his prized logs develop hairline fractures as the wood contracted in the extreme cold. He could feel tiny, needle-like drafts piercing the walls. His wife stuffed rags and newspapers into the cracks, a losing battle against the immense pressure of the cold outside. They were burning through their carefully stacked cords of seasoned fur at a terrifying rate. A winter's supply was vanishing before their eyes. In other homes, the situation was worse. Livestock in less sturdy barns began to perish, freezing to death where they stood. Families brought their most valuable animals, a new calf, a flock of chickens, inside their already crowded homes. The smell of manure and hay mixed with the smoke from overworked stoves. By Thursday, the temperature had reached -35 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was now a constant, brutal force, driving the wind chill to a life-threatening 70 or 80 below. The world outside had become an alien planet, hostile to any form of warmth. Inside, the cabins were failing. Despite the roaring fires, indoor temperatures dropped into the 40s, then the 30s. Water buckets froze solid just a few feet from the hearth. People were wearing their entire wardrobes, coats, hats, gloves, indoors. Sleep was a dangerous proposition, a surrender to a cold that could easily become permanent. Silas Croft was a proud man, but now he was a frightened one. His expertise, his lifetime of knowledge, had met its match. His home was no longer a shelter, it was a trap, consuming fuel at a rate he could not sustain, providing only a marginal and shrinking pocket of survivable air. His certainty had become his prison. And through the haze of smoke and fear, a thought began to gnaw at him, a thought of Elias Thorne. He pictured the tin coffin, the thin steel walls he had warned against. He imagined the brutal, conductive cold sinking through that metal with absolute efficiency. The image he had predicted, a sheet of ice coating the interior walls, came back to him. But now it was not with the satisfaction of being right, but with a sickening knot of guilt in his stomach. He had scoffed. He had joined the chorus of mockers. And now, a man, a woman, and two small children might be paying the ultimate price for it. He imagined them huddled together, their fire long dead, succumbing to the silent, creeping cold. Had he stood by and let a man's pride kill his family? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. He had to go and see. As the vindication of a radical idea approached, the audience for that proof was a single man, burdened by doubt and fear. Before we follow him on that journey, I want to ask you to do one thing. If this story is making you rethink what's possible, hit that like button. Your click tells the algorithm that forgotten history and quiet genius are stories worth sharing. Now let's walk with Silas through the storm. Putting on his gear was a ritual of survival. Layers of wool, a heavy canvas coat, thick felt-lined boots, a fur hat with ear flaps, and a scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes were exposed. The journey to the Thorne homestead was less than a mile, a pleasant walk in the summer. Now, it was a polar expedition. The moment he opened his cabin door, the cold hit him like a physical blow. It stole the breath from his lungs and burned his eyes. The wind tore at him, trying to find any gap in his armor. The snow was not soft powder. It was a dry, granular substance like sand, whipped into deep drifts and scoured bare patches of frozen earth. Every step was a struggle. He leaned into the wind, his head down, following the faint outline of the road. The world was a monochrome nightmare of white and gray. The silence he had noted days before was gone, replaced by the screaming of the wind and the groaning of frozen trees. He was a man moving through a world that wanted him dead. After what felt like an hour, he saw it. Through the driving snow, the strange, curved shape of Thorne's Folly appeared. It looked small and utterly defeated by the vast, violent landscape. And then he noticed the first thing that was wrong: the chimney. From his own chimney and every other in the valley, a thick plume of gray smoke was being ripped away by the wind, the unmistakable sign of a fire being pushed to its absolute limit. But from the pipe sticking out of the Quonset, there was almost nothing. Just a thin, shimmering heat haze, a lazy ribbon of warmth rising into the Arctic air. It was the sign of a fire that was barely trying. It was the sign of an impossibility. Fear warred with confusion in his mind. He pushed forward, wading through a waist-deep drift that had piled up against the structure's eastern wall. He reached the simple wooden door, his gloved hand hesitating for a moment. He braced himself for what he might find inside. He knocked, his fist making a dull thud. He heard footsteps, light and unhurried. The latch clicked. The door swung inward. It was not a sight or a sound that hit him first. It was a feeling. A wave of silent, steady, radiant warmth washed over him, thawing the frozen mask of his scarf, prickling his exposed skin with a feeling he had forgotten was possible. It was not the scorching, directional heat of his own stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from the floor, the walls, the very air itself. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. The scene before him was one of such profound and impossible domestic normalcy that it shattered his understanding of the world. Elias Thorne stood before him, wearing a simple flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His wife, Sarah, was at a wooden table, a dusting of flour on her apron, kneading a great mound of bread dough. And on the pine floor, playing with wooden blocks, were their two small children. They were barefoot. Silas Croft's mind simply stopped. He took in the details, each one a separate, devastating blow to his entire worldview. There was no frost on the windows. He could see the swirling snow outside through clear panes of glass. A pot of water sat on the back of the stove, a gentle plume of steam rising from its surface. The stove itself was not glowing red. It was a placid black, its metal ticking softly, the damper almost fully closed. He was a master builder, a man who thought in terms of insulation and infiltration, of BTUS and cords of wood, and his expert mind began to frantically analyze the impossible data before him. He tore off his gloves and walked, as if in a trance, to the north wall, the wall that was taking the full, unrelenting assault of the Siberian wind. He pressed his bare palm against the smooth pine boards. He expected it to be cold. He would have settled for neutral. The wall was warm, not just lacking in cold, but actively, pleasantly warm to the touch. He pressed his ear to the wood, expecting to hear the howl of the wind. He heard only silence. He turned his attention to the source of the heat. He looked at the wood stove, then at the wood box beside it. It was a simple crate, and it was nearly full of split logs. He looked from the full wood box to Elias, his face a mask of disbelief. "Elias," he began, his voice raspy and cracked. How much wood have you burned?" Elias Thorne looked at the wood box, then back at Silas, a hint of a smile on his face. "Oh, a few logs this morning to get the chill off," he said, his tone casual, as if discussing a mild autumn day. "Kept it banked through the night, of course." The words landed like hammer blows. A few logs. Silas did the math in his head. His own family, in his state-of-the-art cabin, had consumed nearly a full cord of wood in the last 3 days just to keep the indoor temperature from dropping below freezing. His house was a ravenous, inefficient beast. This was a miracle. "My house," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "is maybe 40 degrees right now if I'm lucky." Elias nodded slowly, then pointed to a simple mercury thermometer hanging on the wall, far from the stove. Silas walked over and peered at it. The red line was steady, unwavering. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of more than 100 degrees from the temperature outside. The numbers were undeniable. They were irrefutable. They were a judgment. Silas Croft, the most respected builder in the valley, the man of wood and stone and tradition, stumbled back to a simple wooden chair and sank into it. He put his head in his hands. The warmth of the room felt like a verdict. "I was wrong," he said, the words muffled by his hands, choked with shame and awe. He looked up at Elias, his eyes shining with a new, desperate light. "I was a fool. I called this place a coffin. It's an ark." He leaned forward, his entire being focused on the quiet Wheelwright. "You have to teach me," he pleaded. "You have to show every man in this valley how you did this. You have to." When the great cold snap finally broke, retreating back to the Arctic wastes from which it came, the story spread through the valley, not as a rumor, but as a gospel. And its first apostle was Silas Croft. He went from cabin to cabin, from the trading post to the Grange Hall, and he told the story of what he had seen. He described the barefoot children, the warm walls, the full wood box. Coming from any other man, it might have been dismissed as a tall tale. Coming from Silas Croft, it was fact. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a deep and urgent curiosity. Thorne's folly was never spoken of again. Instead, people started talking about the Thorne method. The tin coffin became the warm home. The community, which had once ostracized Elias for his strange ideas, now sought him out. That spring, Silas Croft was Elias Thorne's first student. The two men, the master of tradition and the master of innovation, worked side by side. They did not build new Quonsets. Instead, they began retrofitting existing log cabins. They built insulated outer shells, creating the same kind of air gap and insulated cavity that had made Elias's home so effective. They dug under existing floors to install rock beds and piped in external air intakes for the stoves. The results were immediate and dramatic. Homes that had once consumed 10 cords of wood a winter were now comfortable with 4. Rooms that had been abandoned from November to March were now livable year-round. The following winter, when the cold returned, it was met not with dread, but with a new sense of security and control. Elias Thorne never sought fame or fortune from his invention. He was a wheelwright, and he remained a wheelwright. When men came to him for advice, he gave it freely, sketching his designs on scraps of wood with a carpenter's pencil. He explained the principles of the thermal battery, the importance of the sealed air gap, the efficiency of the pre-warmed air intake. He gave his knowledge away, and in doing so, he transformed the lives of everyone in the valley. The legacy of his design became woven into the fabric of the community. New homes were built from the ground up using his principles, regardless of their outward appearance. The invisible system, the lung beneath the floor, and the blanket around the walls became the new standard. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human terms. It was measured in the baby who survived its first winter without the constant threat of respiratory illness. It was measured in the rancher's wife who could finally put her sewing table near a window in January. It was measured in the quiet dignity of a family able to move freely through their own home, masters of their environment rather than its prisoners. It was the gift of warmth, a gift more precious than gold in that cold, hard country. The story of Elias Thorne and his tin coffin is more than just a tale of clever engineering. It is a powerful lesson in the conflict between tradition and innovation. It demonstrates that sometimes the most profound solutions come from looking at an old problem with new eyes, from applying knowledge from one field to a completely different one. The established wisdom of the log cabin was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. It had reached the limit of its effectiveness. Elias Thorne, the outsider with his knowledge of engines and airflow, did not reject the past. He built upon it, enclosing it within a new system of understanding. He proved that the most stubborn obstacle is often not the laws of physics, but the assumption that we already have all the answers. The principles he used in 1947 are now at the cutting edge of modern building science. His insulated air gap is a precursor to the ventilated rain screen. His thermal mass foundation is a core concept of passive solar design. His sealed combustion air intake is now a standard requirement for high-efficiency homes. He was, in his own quiet way, a pioneer, decades ahead of his time. If this story of how a junk pile became a sanctuary has warmed you, hit that like button to share it with others. Subscribe for more stories of forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of human ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you have ever had to face? We'd love to hear your story. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and thermodynamic principles discussed are based on real-world building science, the characters, names, and specific sequence of events are products of imagination. This content is inspired by historical contexts, but does not represent a specific historical record, and should not be taken as professional engineering or construction advice.